Yes, J. Edgar Hoover, probably the best informed man in America on this threatening conspiracy, has repeatedly warned us that the gravest danger we face today comes from the socialist communist conspiracy and from within. Many people cannot see how this statement of Mr. Hoover's can be true, since there are supposedly only about 10,000 or so party members in this country. Those who doubt Mr. Hoover overlook the fact that for every member of the communist conspiracy, there are at least 10 others willing and eager to do their bidding. In addition to this, the communists and their fellow travelers move toward key positions by which they can influence many others, just as iron filings move toward a magnet. Also, the communists at this stage do not themselves intend to do much of the actual close-in fighting. Instead, they make use of non-communists to serve their purposes. Their method of operation is to confuse the issues, divide one group against another, and thus to conquer. The communist method of confusing the issues is to use pseudo-idealistic and pseudo-moral words and phrases in order to trap the unwary into following their designs. The fisherman knows that he cannot entice a fish to bite upon a raw steel hook, so he dresses it up with a nice juicy worm, and the poor fish bites. In the same manner, the pseudo-moral and pseudo-idealistic expressions trap many innocents so that they will follow out the aims of the communist conspirators. For example, the false appeals made by the communists in the name of peace and the brotherhood of man. They know full well that communism has nothing in common with these expressions as we understand them, yet they deliberately misuse them in order to deceive. And they are effective. If you want the terrifying facts about the communist use of the Negroes, I recommend Manning Johnson's book, Color, Communism, and Common Sense, a reprint by American Opinion magazine, Belmont 78, Massachusetts. The author, and this is a good example, the author, a Negro, was a communist for 10 years and served on the National Committee for the Communist Party here in America and assisted in the planning of the conspiracy against his own race. Let me pause a moment to point out some pro-communist propaganda which has been widely circulated. It is frequently stated that communism is on the extreme left and fascism is on the extreme right. This is absolutely false. It is true that communism is on the extreme left, but Nazism and fascism are so closely allied with communism that J. Edgar Hoover has called communism red fascism and Nazism black fascism. They are all forms of socialism. And as has been pointed out by well-informed people in the West, they are all forms of governmentism, where the government becomes lord and master, and we become serfs and slaves. The extreme right is composed of the anarchists who believe that people are so good at heart that no government at all is needed. Our forefathers knew that while most people try to do the right thing, there are a few who run amok. They therefore established our great constitutional republic, a government of limited powers. They believed that we must have some government, but it must be bound down by the chains of our Constitution, so that it will not slip farther and farther over into the realm of governmentism, whether it be communism, Nazism, fascism, welfare statism, or some other form of socialism. Please note the words of George Washington, who stated, "Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master." And at a later date, Woodrow Wilson said that the history of liberty is the history of limitations of government power, not the increase of it. And at a still later date, that great spiritual leader and patriot, President David O. McKay, said this: "During the first half of the 20th century, we have traveled far into the soul-destroying land of socialism." Now, I want to point out just a few of the ways in which America is tripping down the primrose path. Anyone who is interested and who would care to make a careful study of the subject will be both amazed and shocked at the progress made by the Marxian socialists in recent years. Their tremendous influence and power can be grasped if we will read the carefully documented book by Dan Smoot, a former FBI administrative supervisor and assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, entitled The Invisible Government. This book shows how the Fabians, operating through many influential organizations, have reached out their tentacles and are throttling free enterprise. At the same time, they are pyramiding and concentrating immense power in the federal government. In this way, the advance of communism is being comforted, aided, and abetted by those who are not members of the communist conspiracy, but who adhere to the same principles. Dr. Karu Hunt, a worldwide authority on communist strategy, states this: "Yet where the ends they seek are concerned, socialism and communism are virtually interchangeable terms, as anyone who consults the Oxford English Dictionary or any standard textbook will discover. Indeed, Lenin's party continued to call itself Social Democrat until the 7th Party Congress of March 1918, when it substituted the term Bolshevik as a protest against the non-revolutionary attitude of the socialist parties of the West." President J. Reuben Clark expressed his conviction on this point in these significant words, quote, "The paths we are following, if we move forward thereon, will inevitably lead us to socialism or communism. And these two are as like as two peas in a pod in their ultimate effect upon our liberties. And never forget for one moment that communism and socialism are state slavery. World conquest has been, is now, and ever will be its ultimate goal." The communists and fellow travelers have never deviated from this objective. Despite the high-pressure campaign they have insidiously directed behind Khrushchev's phrase of peaceful coexistence, the communists know that this is simply a propaganda slogan. It is devised to further their own ends by stirring the hopes and emotions of those who seek an end to the turmoil, fear, and sorrow that world communism itself has created. Actions continue to speak louder than words, and certainly the communists have shown no indication of a sincere quest for peace. Here are a few examples. There are many. The takeover of Cuba and the establishment of a communist base and island fortress in the heart of America. I have been there. The ever-constant infiltration of red fascists into countries of Central and South America to create a Sovietized Latin America. I wish you could hear the testimony of men like Senator Eastland, chairman of the Senate Internal Security Committee, as he unburdened his heart to me regarding the threat, far beyond anything that has been reported, from what's happening in Cuba and the infiltration that's going on into many other Latin American countries. The increase of espionage activities by Soviet and satellite agents in our own country, particularly those who strive to penetrate our government processes from protection afforded them by diplomatic assignments in New York, in the United Nations, and in Washington, D.C. The frantic efforts of the Communist Party USA to subvert our youth, and the intense drive of the communists operating from concealed positions to wrest control of the movement for Negro rights. Does all this indicate a real and sincere desire to live in peaceful coexistence? To the socialist communist conspiracy, there is no such thing as peaceful coexistence, except as a tool for further conquest. Their stated objective is to bury us. Since about the time of Woodrow Wilson, Fabian socialists have been able to cuddle close to key people in our government and those who exercise influence. I will not take time to trace their activities, although it could be done very easily, through the various administrations since Wilson's time. I will be content to give you 2 or 3 examples approximating that of the Fabian socialists. It may shock you to learn that the first communist cell in government, so far as we know, was organized in the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the early 30s. John Apt was there. It was John Apt whom Oswald, the accused assassin of the President Kennedy, requested for his attorney when he was confronted with that question a few days ago. Harry Dexter White was there. and later became Undersecretary of the Treasury. Lee Pressman was there, and Alger Hiss, who was advisor to President Franklin D. Roosevelt at Yalta and Tehran, and who was the principal architect and the first Secretary General of the United Nations organizing meetings, was also there. Today, Walt Whitman Rostow, who is chief planner for the State Department, has expressed a dangerous point of view somewhat like this: we must do everything in our power to avoid irritating and antagonizing the communists. They are, after all, merely rough and crude socialists, and we must avoid doing anything that would escalate into a war. In fact, what we should do is to help them to develop so they will mature and outgrow their violent impulses. In this way, the communists will move somewhat over in our direction. At the same time, we must move our country over toward the left, with more and more socialism until ultimately the two will merge. Each country will then give up its armaments and armed forces and place them in the hands of a one-world government. That would be amusing if it weren't so serious. It's very, very real. And Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., former professor of history at Harvard and now high on the councils of our government, has said this: there seems no inherent obstacle to the gradual advance of socialism in the United States through a series of New Deals, and that socialism appears quite practical as a long-time proposition. In either case, the whole tendency is toward more and more governmentism, more and more centralization, and less individual responsibility and freedom. The threat is very real. An interesting example of the socialist mind at work is the present so-called Civil Rights Bill of 1963. I'm going to quote just a few lines from a talk made by John C. Satterfield, past president of the American Bar Association, over the Mannion Forum weekly broadcast, September 15, 1963. He said, "It is clothed in the name of civil rights, and it is called the Civil Rights Act of 1963. As a matter of fact, it is 10% civil rights and 90% extension of federal executive power at the expense of individuals, states, municipalities, in fact, at the expense of everyone." And from my careful study of the Act, I agree with Mr. Satterfield. With reference to the United Nations and spurious appendages, I would like to quote the Internal Security Report for 1956, page 213, as made by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee as follows: what appears on the surface, at least, to be by far the worst danger spot from the standpoint of disloyalty and subversion activity among Americans employed by international organizations is UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Then in the footnote of this same annual report, we read this: information in the possession of the subcommittee indicating a great deal of evidence not yet publicly adduced points to the possibility that the parent body, the United Nations, may be the worst spot of all. There is no indication that there has been the slightest improvement in the United Nations or its satellites since that time. I have in my possession a copy of an unpublished manuscript on the United Nations Charter, prepared in 1945 and given to me by that eminent international lawyer and former Under-Secretary of State, J. Reuben Clark. President Clark's declarations on this, as on other subjects, emphasize more and more with the passing of time his vision and statesmanship. Commenting on the United Nations Charter and the travesty on exhaustive consideration, as the Charter was hastily approved by the Congress under urging from the State Department, he continues with a devastating analysis and a sober warning to the American people that there will be a day of reckoning. I believe that day is near at hand.